John has, I think his presentation here today is Gettysburg Forgotten Corps Commander, the life and career of Major General George Sykes. John currently serves as a park ranger at Antietam National Battlefield and Gettysburg National Military Park. He is an adjunct instructor at American Military University, a frequent lecturer at roundtables, historical societies, and other places. He is the author of several books and articles, most recently, Confrontation at Gettysburg, A Nation Saved, A Cause Lost, and that was just out in 2012. And he's also the author of A Battle of South Mountain, 2011, as part of the History Press's Civil War Sesquicentennial series, as well as Antietam, September 17, 1862, a work published in 2011. His articles have appeared in several publications, including America's Civil War and Pennsylvania Heritage. Mr. Hoptak is also active in historical preservation, leading the effort to place historical tablets in the city of Pottsville, Pennsylvania, in honor of General James Nagle, and conducting a nationwide campaign to restore the 48th Pennsylvania Monument at Antietam by replacing the missing sword from the Nagle statue. And John tells me as we came up here that he has actually completed that restoration and preservation effort. Without any further ado, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Mr. John Hoptak.
Okay, good morning. Let's see if we can get this. Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Very good. Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you on this morning, this hot morning here at Gettysburg, and I see a lot of familiar faces out there. Sykes, George Sykes. Why in the world would you want to talk about Sykes, right? Well, since I've been working here at Gettysburg, a lot of first-time visitors are overwhelmed with the number of monuments on the battlefield, 1,300 of them, plus most of them, of course, to regiments and other brigades. And there's a small army of bronze generals that stand on the battlefield, and there's just a few of them there, of course. At the top is George Meade, and John Reynolds has 3 statues, 4 monuments if you include the spot where he was killed. Hancock has quite a few. Everybody, or goes the old myth, except the 3rd Corps commander, Dan Sickles. Did anyone ever hear that? That old canard about the battlefield, that Sickles is the only Corps commander without a monument? Well, of course, many of you, seasoned veterans of Gettysburg Military Park, you know that that's not quite true, because there's someone else who's missing, and that is the commander of the 5th Corps, George Sykes. And it's interesting because Sykes, his men, they could have saved the day. In fact, they did save the day on July 2nd here at Gettysburg. His men played a prominent role in the struggle against the Union left up on Little Round Top and in the wheat field. And neither does George Sykes make an appearance in the 1993 movie Gettysburg, although it should be noted that he does make a cameo in The Killer Angels, the novel upon which the movie was based. But when they adapted the novel for the film, his part in the book was taken by Brian Mallon, the fellow who played Winfield Scott Hancock. So there's no denying that George Sykes ranks among those most obscure figures of the war, and that's exactly why I chose to talk about him in this Sacred Trust lecture, to try to rescue him, if you will, from the halls of historical obscurity. And what better time than now, as we look back and commemorate the 150th anniversary of what many will tell you was Sykes' finest hour in uniform. Now, it's very difficult to put together a portrait of Sykes because of the 60,000 plus books that have been written on the Civil War. There's not a single biography of Sykes. So you have to dig a little deeper. You got to look at first-hand observations and other sources. And from a personal point of view, the ever-observant Frank Haskell of the 2nd Corps wrote that Sykes was a small, rather thin man, well-dressed and gentlemanly, brown hair and beard which he wears full, with a red, pinched, rough-looking skin, feeble blue eyes, large nose, and the general air of one who is wary and is a little ill-natured. Now, from a professional point of view, Sykes was the consummate professional, a West Pointer who by the time of his death had put in nearly 40 years of service in the United States Army. And when you examine the writings of professional career soldiers, whether they served alongside Sykes or under his command in the U.S. regulars, there is nothing but praise and high esteem for a general who is best known to us today as Tardy George. that nickname of Tardy George. Now, despite this nickname, Sykes knew and understood what his duties were and always endeavored to carry them out. George Cullum, in his History of West Point, described Sykes as a model soldier, always at his post, ever ready, faithfully, and promptly to perform every duty entrusted to him. He was a strict disciplinarian, but one who asked nothing of his men that he was not willing to endure himself. He looked upon his profession as one in which honor was to be achieved only by hard, conscientious work, and he did work nobly and faithfully throughout his 38 years of service. Now, Dangerfield Parker, who served under Sykes in the war, would echo this sentiment when he wrote that Sykes was an officer for whom I have always had an ardent admiration. He was a born soldier and displayed conspicuous ability in every position in which he was placed. He possessed in a high degree the skill necessary to handle large bodies of troops. As a man, he was upright and chivalrous. As a companion, courteous, and to his intimates, genial. And finally, rounding out this high praise of Sykes from his regular Army soldiers was Patrick Breen, who served under Sykes throughout most of his time with the Army of the Potomac. No braver officer unsheathed his sword for the Union than Sykes. Chivalrous, valiant, and enthusiastic on all occasions, always on the keen lookout for the welfare of his men, both in camp and on the march. But while the professional soldiers had nothing but praise for Sykes, there's a little bit of a different story for the volunteers who served under his command. These volunteers had a lot of respect for Sykes, but perhaps he was a little bit too strict, a little bit too rigid. And along with most of the West Point trained officers, Sykes did harbor some doubt about the fighting ability of his volunteers. And this is brought to our attention by Francis Donaldson of the 118th Pennsylvania. He wrote that General Sykes is a martinet, a severe, unkindly man to everybody except the regulars. Himself a West Point graduate, a thorough soldier, brave and accomplished, in whom the men have great confidence, fear, and respect. Yet he spoils all of this by his undisguised contempt and hatred of the volunteers. This the men know, so there is no sympathy between him and them. He never speaks to an enlisted volunteer, and on the march always halts among the regular troops. Yet for all of this, we are still proud of our commander. He looks well to our wants and handles us with skill and ability. We consider Sykes one of the great men of the Army, but his manner is against him, and he will never make a great name for himself. Now, Donaldson wrote that in September of 1863, and those words have proved prophetic. So now the question is, why do we know so little about Sykes? And there's a few reasons why. First of all, he was one of those guys who never sought fame or attention. He never advertised or marketed himself. He had no connections to newspapers, to journalists, or to politicians. Neither did he, or at least as far as I know, keep any diaries or write his memoirs. Very few letters that were written by Sykes have been discovered today. And Sykes also steered clear of all the infighting and bickering that characterized the Army of the Potomac. He did not find himself involved in many scandals, nor did he ruffle many feathers. Simply speaking, he did his job and kept his mouth shut. He did not actively seek promotion. Instead, he let the record speak for itself, modest to a fault. And another reason why, perhaps the biggest reason why, for much of his time with the Army of the Potomac, Sykes commanded the only division of regular soldiers. These men did not write as prolifically after the war as volunteers. Like Sykes, these were soldiers who made the Army their career. And like Sykes, they let the record speak for itself. Now, by way of background, George Sykes was born in Delaware in October of 1822. The Sykes name was a prominent one in Delaware. His great-grandfather and grandfather were both well-respected physicians, and both had dabbled in politics. His great-grandfather, James Sykes, was a delegate to the Continental Congress, and his grandfather, also named James, served for a brief period as an interim governor of the state of Delaware. Now, little is known about Sykes' earliest days, except that he attended some local schools before receiving an appointment to West Point in 1838. So in the spring of 1838, Sykes is 15 years old, and he entered the military academy. He graduated 4 years later in 1842 in that very famous class, and his roommate for much of his time at the academy was Daniel Harvey Hill, of course, who would go on to lead Confederate troops. Now, it must be noted that it was at West Point, and not on any battlefield of the Civil War, where Sykes acquired the nickname of Tardy George. Okay, it was there that his classmates were struck by his quiet calm, his reserve, and his deliberation in his studies, and thus the nickname. But this nickname will continue to haunt him even today. As I mentioned before, when you think about Sykes, you think about Tardy George. A colleague of mine joked that I should show up late for this talk, just because it is about Sykes. But as historian Timothy Reese pointed out, Sykes' discretion and his reserve were mistaken by historians for hesitation and dullness. Nevertheless, Sykes did seem to struggle with his studies. He graduated 39th out of 56 graduates in 1842, and among those who graduated alongside Sykes, of course, his roommate, D.H. Hill. Also in that class, William Rosecrans, John Pope, Abner Doubleday, Richard Anderson, Lafayette McLaws, and ranked 54 out of 56, James Longstreet. Okay, so it's a pretty illustrious class. Sykes became a second lieutenant upon graduation, and his first assignment found him in Florida, involved with the nation's wars against the Seminole. From there, it was off to Mexico, and by this time, he was a first lieutenant. And along with so many other future Civil War commanders, he performed gallantly. He's going to receive a brevet promotion for his actions at the Battle of Cerro Gordo in 1847, and an officer who served alongside Sykes in Mexico wrote that he was always ready for anything proposed. He was simple-hearted, honest, and eminently true, a first-rate duty man, generous and considerate of others, and modest to a fault. Now, Sykes remained in the Army following the Mexican War and found himself stationed at a number of frontier posts. He saw some action battling the Apache in 1854 and against the Navajo in 1859. And of Sykes in the 1850s, Captain Thomas Anderson, who was the nephew of Robert Anderson of Fort Sumter fame, wrote that Sykes, well, it would have been hard to find a better officer in the Army. He was so thoroughly and simply a soldier that he knew little of politics and cared less. He was unsympathetic and methodical, a man of details, diligent and untiring, one of the coolest men in danger or confusion that we had in the whole Army. He enforced discipline like a machine and had apparently no more sentiment than a gun stock. I think that's a good description of Sykes. Now, in 1855, at the age of 33, Sykes was promoted to the rank of captain, and he would hold that rank until the outbreak of war 6 years later. Now, in 1861, Sykes found himself stationed down at Fort Clark in Texas with a sizable contingent of the 3rd U.S. Infantry. Already by this point, Lincoln had been elected, war clouds were hovering in the air, and on February 1st of 1861, Texas seceded from the Union. 20 days later, Sykes was told to get out, to leave. And so he and his 5 companies had a 300-mile trek to the Texas coast. On March 9th, he and his men began this long journey. Now, Sykes had issued very strict orders to the men of the 3rd not to forage and not to capture or kill any of the livestock they may have encountered. But one day, 4 of Sykes' men were seen carrying a large dead hog. The matter was brought to his attention, and, said William Bell, there commenced a punishment that lasted for days, that was hard on the offenders and mortifying to the hog. He ordered the animal to be quartered, and a quarter to be hung about the neck of each of the offenders. And these necklaces, with their pendants, were to be worn day and night until further orders. About the middle of the 2nd day, under the influence of the warm sun, the effect of this treatment began to make itself manifest. Such odors swept back over the train and the column as we never inhaled. Everyone forswore pork and cursed Sykes' devilish ingenuity in the same breath. Toward evening, it became unbearable, and a deputation waited upon Sykes and begged him, by everything that he held sacred, to give us a rest. The pork was buried, the air began to get pure again, and there was no more hog stealing. Now, at long last, after that 300-mile journey, Sykes and his men arrived at Indianola on the coast of Texas, and the date was April 12th. Hundreds of miles away, of course, the war's opening salvos were being fired upon Fort Sumter. Now, that day, April 12th, Sykes and his men set sail on the steamer Empire City, heading toward Washington by way of Havana, Cuba, and New York City. Sykes was very fortunate to get out of Texas when he did, because after the commencement of hostilities, Confederate authorities deemed that all U.S. troops still in Texas were considered prisoners or captive, and they were temporarily detained from leaving the state. Now, Sykes will sail on to Havana. It was there, when they were taking on coal, that he learned about Fort Sumter. And when they arrived in New York City just a few days later, they found thousands and thousands of men mobilizing for war. Sykes arrived in Washington himself on May the 10th of 1861, and he and his men were the first contingent of regulars to reach Washington upon the outbreak of war. Now, 4 days later, and because of the defection of 300 Southern-born officers, Sykes was promoted to the rank of major. Now, he would briefly serve under Robert Patterson in the Shenandoah Valley, but just prior to the first Bull Run campaign, Winfield Scott is going to request that Sykes and his battalion of regulars return to Washington to form part of Irvin McDowell's army as McDowell prepared to attack Pierre Beauregard at Manassas. Now, Sykes and his battalion found themselves in the thick of the fight at First Bull Run. Forming part of McDowell's flanking column, Sykes' men fell in behind Ambrose Burnside's brigade at the forefront of the advance. Coming into contact with Shanks Evans' Confederates, Burnside's men were in need of support, and Sykes got the nod. Before going into action, Sykes summoned his company commanders. He made a short speech, recalled one of them, cautioning them to keep from getting excited and to fire low. He told them that they were regulars and were regarded as the mainstay of the brigade. He called his officers about him and told them that he had every confidence in us. With that, the orders went out and Sykes led his men forward. When Ambrose Burnside saw him coming, he shouted out, "Good God, Sykes, your regulars are just what we need." Apparently, Burnside had got quite demonstrative in his exclamations because Sykes turned to one of his captains and said, "Pay no attention to that man is crazy." Moving forward, the Union troops drove back Evans' brigade as well as the brigades under Bernard B. and Francis Bartow, and having driven the Confederates back to Henry House Hill, Sykes' men were set up to provide artillery support. A little bit later on, however, Stonewall Jackson and additional troops under Joseph Johnston will arrive and smash into the Union right flank. Irvin McDowell is going to turn to George Sykes and his regulars to steady the volunteers and stem the gray tide. Even as the volunteers were running pell-mell for the rear, Sykes led his men forward toward the sound of combat. No sooner did they arrive than Oliver Howard's brigade bolted for the rear. "All was lost," wrote Dangerfield Parker. "The whole field, as far as the eye could reach, was covered with panic-stricken and flying men." Sykes and his men delivered a few well-aimed volleys that staggered the Confederate line. But then rebel cavalry came galloping toward Sykes' right and his rear. And to deal with that, Sykes ordered his battalion of regulars to form square. And from this formation, they wreaked havoc on the Confederates. Even Pierre Beauregard would write that that was an incomparable body of regular infantry. But soon Confederate artillery began bursting among Sykes' men, and slowly they fell back toward that stone bridge across the Bull Run Creek. As they arrived there, they saw another brigade of infantry commanded by William T. Sherman. Sherman's men, however, did not stay long once they saw Sykes' men approach. It wasn't until 8 o'clock that night that Sykes and his men will cross the Bull Run, having paid a high price for their heroics. Now, after the First Battle of Manassas, Sykes will return to Washington, go into camp at Arlington Heights, and a few days later, Irvin McDowell introduced Lincoln to Sykes, telling him that it was these men who saved the Army at First Bull Run. Now, that army was soon to become under the command of George McClellan, who's going to refashion it, who's going to organize it, and who's going to baptize it as the Army of the Potomac. And from the very start, McClellan wanted the regulars to form the core, the nucleus of this army. And the soldier McClellan found most suited to lead the regulars was 39-year-old George Sykes. Now, the first order of business for Sykes was to go into the city of Washington and begin reining in all these undisciplined volunteers, rooting them out of the taverns and the bars. In August of 1861, it was Sykes who helped to quell a few threatened mutinies in the camps of the 2nd Maine and the 79th New York. And in February of 1862, Sykes was called upon for that unenviable task of arresting General Charles Stone, who was scapegoated for the disaster at Ball's Bluff. Now, all the while, his regulars began to grow. In March, Sykes is going to be promoted to brigadier general, interestingly enough, of volunteers and not of regulars, even though at that point he commanded the largest force of U.S. volunteers since Winfield Scott 15 years earlier in the Mexican War. Now, at the outset of the Peninsula Campaign, Sykes is going to command the U.S. Division of Regulars, and he's going to lead it for the next 15 months. Time won't allow me to get into the details of each of the combats in which he was, but we need to make note of some of his memorable fights, including at Gaines' Mill. Now, at Gaines' Mill, on June the 27th of 1862, Sykes' division got their first real test of combat. They held the right flank of the 5th Corps line, and the 5th Corps was isolated. And they were told by McClellan to buy as much time as possible so that he could further withdraw the army toward the James. Sykes' 3 brigades put up a stout resistance, but his ammunition was running low. Then a fresh wave of Confederate infantry arrived on the scene, commanded by his old West Point classmate, Daniel Harvey Hill. Later on, Harvey Hill will write about Gaines' Mill in Battles and Leaders of the Civil War that one of the saddest things connected with the miserable fratricidal war was the breaking of ties of friendship and of blood. The troops opposing mine on that murderous field that day were the regulars of George Sykes, a Southerner by birth and my roommate at West Point, a man admired by all for his honor, courage, and frankness, and particularly endeared to me by his social qualities. Now, coming from the irascible, irritable, and ill-tempered Harvey Hill, this was pretty high praise indeed. Casualties were heavy as Sykes' men at last withdrew from the fight. And one of the men who observed the battle noted that Sykes' men had stood like an iron wall. And isn't it interesting, at First Bull Run, Thomas Jackson got that nickname of Stonewall. What would our image be today of Sykes if that nickname had stuck, right? Iron Wall Sykes. At 2nd Manassas on August 30th of 1862, Sykes found himself on a familiar battlefield and once again performing a familiar role. The 5th Corps held the left flank of Pope's army, and they had the unenviable position of being struck by Longstreet's tide as they came crashing down. Sykes would form up his men to meet Longstreet's attack. His 3rd Brigade under Gouverneur K. Warren was cut to pieces. The 5th and 10th New York, of the 490 men of the 5th New York, 320 would become casualties, including 117 men killed. Sykes' other 2 brigades of regulars will fall back slowly, methodically, under a storm of shot and shell, retiring toward Henry House Hill, a familiar spot. And once again, John Pope will turn to Sykes and tell him to cover the Army's retreat. So you might argue that it was Sykes who saved one army at First Bull Run and saved another one at Second Bull Run just about 1 year later. But very seldom does glory go to the guy who covers retreats. But a shot at glory did come to Sykes on September 17th at Antietam. Now, on that day, with the Army back under the command of George McClellan, Sykes and his men held the center of the Union line, and they had approached to within a few hundred yards. Here we are. They had approached to within a few hundred yards of a very weak Confederate center. One of the captains on the front sent back an urgent request to his brigade commander. He wanted to go forward. He wanted to drive the Confederates off a position called Cemetery Hill. Sykes received the request, and at that moment he was sitting next to Porter and McClellan. And as the story goes, Sykes and McClellan, they wanted to throw Sykes' men into battle, to perhaps cut the Confederate army in two. But that was that familiar story when Porter will turn to McClellan and say, "General, remember, I command the last reserve of the last army of this republic." So instead of issuing orders to advance, Sykes was told to stay where he was, and his men simply could not believe it. A shot at glory, they thought, had been slipped away. Now, Sykes will continue to command his regulars through Fredericksburg, and during the Chancellorsville campaign, once again, the Army's under a new commander. This time, it was Joseph Hooker. And Hooker had stolen a march on Lee, had gotten around the Confederate Army, and on May the 1st of 1863, he led that army toward the rear of the Confederate lines. At the forefront of the advance was Sykes and his regulars. His men soon came into contact with another West Point classmate, Lafayette McLaws, and they became generally engaged. My position was critical, said Sykes, but he was determined to hold it as long as possible. His men traded volleys, and Sykes waited the arrival of reinforcements. Instead, he got an order from Hooker to retreat. No doubt shaking his head in disgust, Sykes gave the order, and again, any shot at glory had vanished. As one of Sykes's men wrote, the men were full of fight and moved with alacrity, but alas, we were ordered back. Then there was heard cursing and grumbling from the regulars, not at being ordered into danger, but at being ordered out. All knew too well that someone had blundered. And that somebody, at least according to Sykes and the regulars, was Joseph Hooker, who had lost at Chancellorsville. Now, following his victory at Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee is going to lead his army in an invasion of the North. Of course, that campaign is going to culminate here at Gettysburg during the first 3 days of July. Joe Hooker is going to lead the Union Army in pursuit, and as they arrive near Frederick on June the 28th, well, at last, President Lincoln's patience with Fighting Joe had run out. George Meade was awoken in his tent at 3 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, June the 28th, and he was named the new Army commander. Now, Meade was the commander of the 5th Army Corps, and George Sykes, as the senior officer present, was elevated to command of the 5th Corps. So we often talk about Meade being just 3 days on the job here at Gettysburg. The same was true of Sykes when he would lead his 5th Corps into action here. Now, from Frederick, Sykes will undertake a series of marathon marches as the commander of the 5th Corps. They will arrive in Hanover on the evening of July 1st after a hard day's march. But no sooner had they gone into camp than orders will arrive from Meade. Meade had encountered Lee's army here at Gettysburg, and he has decided to commit to battle here. So late on July 1st, the 5th Corps will begin to make its way from Hanover, and they're going to arrive at a town about 4 miles to the east called Bonneville. He would send a courier racing off to find Meade, telling him that he was only a few miles away. That courier is going to be intercepted by Confederate troops under Richard Ewell. And that would help deter Ewell from striking up at Culp's Hill that night. So you might argue that George Sykes inadvertently saved the Union Army's right flank on the night of July 1st. Now, arriving in position about 9 o'clock on the morning of July 2nd, much of the day will pass with the 5th Corps holding on in the Army's reserve near Powers Hill. But at 3 o'clock that afternoon, Sykes was called to Meade's headquarters at the Leicester House, and at that moment, Sykes was about to face a crisis. Sickles had advanced his 3rd Corps, and Meade is going to dismiss his meeting. He's going to turn to Sykes and tell him to throw my whole corps to that point and hold it at all hazards. Now, there's a Dale Gallen painting there. I like this one because it actually depicts George Sykes in the background. Can you all see him giving orders to a staff officer? I think that's the only painting I have found, current day painting, of Sykes actually on a battlefield. So George Sykes will return to his men on Powers Hill, and he'll turn them to their position to the south. En route to this position, various staff officers from General Sickles met me, and in the name of that officer asked me for assistance. I explained to them that it was impossible for me to give it, because the key of the battlefield was entrusted to my keeping, and I could not and would not jeopardize it by a division of my forces. Now, as Sykes led his men toward the Union left, his 3 divisions are following behind him. Up first was James Barnes and his 1st Division. And as Sykes made his way to the area around the Taneytown Road and the northern shoulder of Round Top, that's when he's going to be met by a staff officer from Gouverneur Warren. Gouverneur Warren, the chief engineer of the Army, had needed men up on Little Round Top, and Sykes will direct him to Barnes. Well, ultimately, we know what's going to happen. That staff officer apparently couldn't find Barnes, but he found the brigade at the forefront of the advance under Strong Vincent. And Vincent's men will make their way to Little Round Top just in time to turn back the repeated assaults of the Texans and Alabama troops from Longstreet's command. In the meantime, Sykes is going to gallop all the way to the wheat field, and he's going to meet with David Bell Birney, who had a division of Sickles' 3rd Corps. Sykes knows that Birney's men are spread very thin, so he will tell him to move his men toward Devil's Den on his left flank. Sykes, in the meantime, will bring forward Tilton and Schweitzer's brigade to the position on Stony Hill to the right of Birney. There they will be engaged in terrific combat against the approaching Confederates. Meanwhile, Sykes' other two divisions were arriving on the field. Ayer's division, his beloved regulars, reach the front and go sweeping down the Valley of Death, only to be repulsed by Longstreet's oncoming tide. It wasn't long after that, though, before Crawford's division arrived to drive back Longstreet for good. Now, night closed the fight, and as Sykes wrote, the key of the battlefield was in our position intact. Vincent, Weed, Hazlett, chiefs lamented throughout the whole corps and army, sealed with their lives the spot entrusted to their keeping, and on which so much depended. I am happy to say that the Fifth Corps sustained its reputation, and important duty was confided to it, which was faithfully and gallantly performed. Now, ever since the Battle of Gettysburg, well, the reviews have been mixed. There are those who praise Sykes in his first test as a corps commander. He responded well to the crisis, that he got his men to the left and he sent them to the key critical spots, including Round Top. Others will tell you that Sykes was overwhelmed, that he was in over his head and his Fifth Corps was sent all to pieces to different parts of the battlefield. And those who believe in this will say that there's a good reason why there is no monument to Sykes on the battlefield. Either way, George Sykes will continue to command the Fifth Corps throughout that fall. But in the spring of 1864, unexpectedly, he's going to be removed from command. Now, Grant had come east with a new rank, and he decided to travel along with George Meade and the Army of the Potomac. Reorganization was needed. The 11th and 12th Corps had already been detached, and the 1st and 3rd Corps never fully recovered from their losses here at Gettysburg. So those men will be fused in with the 2nd, 5th, and the 6th Corps. Hancock retained command of the 2nd Corps, Sedgwick the 6th, but Sykes was removed from command of the 5th Corps and replaced by that savior of Little Round Top, Gouverneur Warren. Now, apparently, Meade knew these changes were coming. In his biography of George Meade, Freeman Cleaves wrote that in February of '64, he went to the War Department. He met with Stanton, who told him that Sykes, John Newton, William French, and Alfred Pleasanton were all on the chopping block. Meade protested, except for the case of Pleasanton, but there was nothing he could do. So why was Sykes relieved of his command? The traditional answer is that Grant and Stanton had found him too cautious, that he lacked the aggressive spirit needed on the battlefield, but it seems that this thought is largely because of that nickname of Tardy George, a nickname that he got at West Point. Others think that there was a fallout between Meade and Sykes following Gettysburg, but I really have not found where that fallout may have been between those two commanders. Or perhaps another possibility is that his association, his longtime friendship with George McClellan and Fitz Porter had caught up with them, that the Committee on the Conduct of War might have taken a little bit longer, but at last they would get George Sykes out of command. Now, Timothy Reese, in his History of the Regulars, he put forward the thought that it was poor health that led to Sykes' removal. As Reese wrote, Sykes' physical appearance had deteriorated and he was suffering from sciatica, with the nerves in his legs and hips failing. And the day after he was relieved, the medical director of the 5th Corps recommended an immediate leave of absence for George Sykes. He departed his 5th Corps, and he's going to spend the rest of the war out west, in the District of Kansas, in a backwater post. In March of 1865, he's going to be breveted a brigadier general in the regular army for his services right here at Gettysburg. And at the same time, he's breveted to the rank of major general for his services throughout the entire war. But once the war was over, Sykes is going to revert back to his rank of lieutenant colonel. And he will watch as he gets stationed to one frontier post after the other. He will watch as those who served under him got higher commands. Then in the late 1860s, he heard from the War Department that he was being considered for promotion to colonel by brevet only, or honorary rank. he wrote a letter of protest. He said that if these and other services do not entitle me to the same preferment as that conferred upon my equals in rank, upon those who have served under me, and upon some who have never been in the field at all, then I do not desire any promotion, and therefore respectfully decline the brevet of colonel offered. It wasn't until 1878 that Sykes would be promoted to full colonel. That same year, Sykes and his wife, Emily, got divorced, the strain of frontier life perhaps too much for them to endure. Even so, in his last will and testament, Sykes bequeathed much of his estate to his ex-wife, including his savings, as well as some land holdings in Minnesota and Missouri. He also provided for his daughter, Anna, and his two sons, George and McCrea, to whom he left his swords, medals, military commissions, and his 5th Corps badge. After a long battle with cancer, Sykes will die at his post at Fort Brown, Texas, on February 8, 1880, at the young age of 57. Tim Reese wrote that cancer had engulfed the left side of his face, doubtless the result of too many years' service in the broiling western sun. He was buried at Brownsville, Texas. Now, since then, and even before, his memory has slipped from us. His death was lamented, to be sure, by those who knew him best, including George McClellan. When McClellan heard of Sykes' death, he wrote, "As a gentleman, his character was the highest, also the purest, and he endeared himself to all who were so fortunate to be associated with him. As a soldier, his record was one that all might be too glad to possess." Now, over the next few decades, monuments began to appear here at Gettysburg in great number, dotting the landscape. Of course, absent, though not noticeably absent, is a statue to George Sykes. The record does indicate, though, that there were 2 efforts made to get a monument to Sykes on this battlefield. In 1898, Representative Howard Hanson of Maryland put forward a bill requesting the appropriation of $25,000 for the construction of an equestrian monument to Sykes on the battlefield. As they wrote, it was to pay tribute to Sykes, to General John Sykes. And the following year, the state of Delaware sought $25,000 to pay tribute to their native son, Sykes, who died leading the regulars into combat at Gettysburg. Perhaps all we need to know about how we remember George Sykes is right there. One state got his name wrong. The other state thought he had been killed in action here at Gettysburg. It must be noted, though, that today there is a monument to Sykes, and it stands over his grave at West Point. When Sykes died in 1880, his body was buried at Brownsville, Texas. The following year, and at the urging of the junior senator from Rhode Island, Ambrose Burnside, the Senate set aside $1,000 to remove Sykes' remains and bury them at West Point. After that, a committee was formed for the purpose of raising money for the construction of an appropriate stone, a committee that was headed by John Porter. A call went out for money, and those who contributed reads like a who's who of former Civil War officers. Among those who donated was William Sherman, Abner Doubleday, John Hatch, Roman Ayers, Montgomery Meigs, John Gibbon, Marcina Patrick, Henry Slocum, and literally hundreds of others. The money was raised, that monument was placed, and upon the stone are 3 words: duty, honor, courage. It was a fitting epitaph, and I think one that George Sykes, he probably at least would have nodded in approval. Thank you so much for your time this morning. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.
If you have questions, please raise your hands and I'll come to you.
Thanks, John. Do you have any information that Sykes criticized Caldwells Division in the wheat field?
Yeah, there was a fallout, and you could really, I think, perhaps do a whole program on the fallout of Gettysburg. I don't know about Caldwell. I know he would go after Crawford, one of his own divisional commanders, because Crawford was taking a lot of the glory for Gettysburg, and Sykes was always writing to remind him that, hey, you know, you did your duty along with everybody else. I haven't really saw anything about Caldwell. I'll have to look further into it. I know that David Birney of the 3rd Corps is going to get wrapped up in that whole Sickles Historicus battle with Sykes after the battle here, and Birney is going to claim that oh, Sykes would have been there sooner, but he told me his men were just then busy preparing coffee, and Sykes went on the attack. This was one of the only times that Sykes wrote to newspapers and adamantly denied that, and because of that, because it was the only time, I tend to believe him there. So.
I'd like to ask about the difference between the regular forces and the state volunteers. I've been trying to reconstruct the history of the 11th United States Regulars because of an ancestor. And this was a regular unit, but newly formed.
Yes.
And it was made up in the same way that the volunteers were.
Yep.
Created at Boston in July of 1861, and then sent to the front in October of 1861. So I'm interested in knowing what amounts to the difference concerning these regular regiments. And another question is, after this battle, some of Sykes' division was then sent to New York to suppress the draft riots, and then did other things that seemed to be more of that character, guarding trains and warding off copperheads and things like this. So I wonder if you could look into those two aspects.
Sure. I would begin by recommending the book by Timothy Reese on Sykes' regular division. But essentially, when the war begins, there's 15,000 or so U.S. Army soldiers in the U.S. Army, and that was it. 10 regiments of infantry, and after the war began, Abraham Lincoln authorized, I think, 10 more. So that became the 11th through the 19th, and they would be attached to Sykes' command as well. And you're right, they were recruited from all across the country, which is one of the reasons why we don't know much about the regulars as opposed to the volunteers. Volunteer regiments were recruited from the same community, the same town. They all knew one another growing up. They fought alongside one another, and after the war, they maintained very close, ties and veterans organizations. After the war, these regulars were sent all over the place to the western frontier, and they really didn't write as much, and they didn't maintain as close of veterans groups. So the regulars, the difference was that they became soldiers for their career. And I believe if you volunteered to fight with a U.S. regular outfit, you got trained by some of the best officers, those who had made the military their career, and you signed up for a 5-year enlistment. Volunteers, for the most part, are 3 years or 9 months or that. And after the Gettysburg campaign, the regulars would be sent up to New York City to help deal with the rioting that was going on. Sykes would be around during the Bristow Station campaign in the fall, and some people believe it was there that he ran afoul of Meade, that Meade kind of wasn't too pleased with Sykes' performance. But again, I can't recommend that book highly enough. It's a tremendous book. Very good. Anything else? Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I missed the beginning. Was George Sykes, stiff, or was he gregarious, outgoing, or was just a professional?
It seemed if you got to know Sykes well, he was a great companion, but it was very tough to get to know him well. He only had a few, I think, really intimate friends, really close friends. And I think the description that sums him up the best was that one by Thomas Anderson that said he enforced discipline like a machine, and he had no more sentiment than a gun stock. So he was a tough nut to crack, but once you did get to know him, he was a pretty good fellow, as Daniel Harvey Hill would say. Not really outgoing or anything. There's a story after Fredericksburg, when they banned liquor in all the camps in that winter of despair, that he was walking back to his headquarters and he heard some of his regulars in their tent acting up. They had gotten drunk. So he popped his head through the tent, and in classic George Sykes language said, "I demand to know the meaning of this moment of inebriety." I don't think he was really a fun guy, unless you really knew him well.
Any other questions?
All right, it looks like oh, yes, sir, you got a question here?
Yeah.
Just really an add-on to what was just asked. Who were his friends of high office in the Army of the Potomac?
It would seem that Sykes' closest friends were Fitz Porter and George McClellan. And I think it was an association with those two that kind of gave him a black mark in the eyes of the Committee on the Conduct of War. After Fitzporter was court-martialed after Second Bull Run, Sykes watched as many of his men got swept up in that. Anybody who associated with those two, like Robert Christie Buchanan, was one of Sykes's brigade commanders, and Buchanan was told that he's being promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers, so he left the regulars, got to Washington, only to discover that the Senate had pulled the rug under him, and he was assigned instead to Baltimore. And another one was Charles Lavelle, who commanded one of the brigades. Lavelle was sent all the way up to, I believe, Madison, Wisconsin. This was all the fallout of Second Bull Run when John Pope brought charges against the 5th Corps. So I think in terms of close associates from West Point, at least it was his roommate Harvey Hill, and those who served with Sykes throughout the entirety of his service.
Any idea of his relationship with Reynolds or Hancock?
I don't. He probably would have had respect for Reynolds, but I encountered nothing that they were close friends or anything, and the same thing with Hancock. He didn't have the flash and the dash of a Hancock, and he probably didn't like that. He didn't really care much for show, and there were those in the Army who had plenty of it. So he probably steered clear of those guys, especially like Pleasanton and Sickles, and perhaps Hancock too. And poor Sykes, he never made a name for himself. And even after Gettysburg, in September, after commanding the 5th Corps now, I guess would be 3 months, he was making his way back to his headquarters. He used to patrol his camps in the middle of the night. And the 118th Pennsylvania, someone had mistakenly established a picket line inside another picket line. So Sykes made his way through the first picket line. It was a rainy night. He had on a gum blanket over his uniform. He got to the second picket line where one of the 5th Corps soldiers pointed his musket at him and demanded he get off the horse. And Sykes was upset. He said, "I've been in command of this corps for months, and by now you should know who I am." So he got down off the horse and he pulled off the gum blanket, and it revealed his uniform with his general stars. And he says, "Now do you know who I am?" And the soldier said, "No." So Sykes began to scream and got upset when another man yelled out, "Hello, Billy, who have you got there?" He says, "I have someone trying to get through my line." He goes, "Does he have a beard?" He goes, "Yes, he does." He goes, "You captured Mosby," because they were on the look for John Mosby. So, like I said, Sykes is, he just really doesn't get the recognition that I think he's entitled to. I'm one of those who think that he does do a good job here at Gettysburg, considering that he was thrown immediately into the fire on the left, and his men do preserve the Union that day. So.
Hi, John. Whoops. Thank you for shedding light on somebody that you don't often hear about.
Yep.
And as always, your talks are fascinating. So I smell a book in the offing here.
It would be a very short one. I was told to prepare a 45-minute program on Sykes, and I was afraid I wouldn't get half that. Maybe.
Are you working on anything else?
Not at the moment. Nope, just enjoying fatherhood. My 7-week-old. So
congratulations.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you again so much. It was great to see you on this hot morning.